Hello everybody. Today is January 28th. It is Thursday. This is very dark. I do not know why it is so dark. Okay, that's better. Um, so today I'm going to be starting with my reading vlog review of the next Thirst book in the Thirst series, which is called The Shadow of Death. This is the second full-length novel of the series. If you have missed any of the other videos leading up to this point, I would recommend going back and watching the first one, or if you haven't read any of these books, I would recommend reading them because this vlog is going to be spoiler filled. I am going to be talking about this book with different scenes that are involved with it and all these things. Basically what we know going into this one is that after the events of the last book, which if you haven't watched that video and you have read up to this point, I would definitely go watch it. The very end of the last book basically had where Sita ended up actually dying, and supposedly so did her descendant Terry, who we had met in the last book. There was a whole arc where basically Sita had known that Terry was a descendant of hers and she was looking after her, and all the while that was happening, Sita finds out that somebody's basically on her tail. Someone knows who she is, someone is coming after her, but she doesn't know why, she doesn't know who. But there seem to be two separate camps of people. One involves this woman named Bertrand, who is part of this kind of governmental agency of sorts where she is looking into the money aspect of Sita and is looking to use this weapon against her that they call the Array, which we don't know much about what it is. We do know that it is powered somehow by this group, and we also know that one character named Shanti, who comes up in that book, is somehow involved with the Array. She's somehow being targeted because of what she does with the Array that she doesn't even really know about, but we do know that Shanti is a kind of protector. She is basically a shield against the Array, and I believe that is why they want to kill her. There is this other camp of people called the Tellar, who are a very old race of people. They are essentially immortal beings, and they've been around about as long, if not longer, than Sita has herself, and Sita is 5,000 years old. More than that now at this point. But the Tellar are basically a group of people who had wanted to kill off Yaksha, who was Sita's creator and all of these things, and so they're after her because they think that she can lead them to something that Yaksha had essentially hidden away for years. That would explain what exactly is the purpose of the Array, how they're supposed to basically get back on top from this other group because they're basically feuding with Bertrand's group, and there also may have something to do with little baby John, who we had met books before, because he does have some small part in all of this that we're not quite clear on as of yet. John, though, is now a 16-year-old boy as opposed to when we first met him when he was a newborn. And so there's like a bunch of different threads here that we kind of start seeing it all come together in the last full-length novel. Now, this one, like I said, the very end of the last one, we saw Sita had died as well as her descendant Terry. However, what kind of happened was this very strange phenomenon where when both Sita and Terry died, they essentially had their souls swapped. Terry's soul had left her body and essentially went into the ether, but Sita's soul somehow got transferred into Terry's body. So Terry looks like she's still alive, but it's not really Terry. It's actually Sita and Terry's body. And we also know that Terry's boyfriend at the time, whose name is Matt, he is actually part Tellar. He is actually the son of Yaksha that supposedly was killed thousands of years ago, but somehow had survived. And we find that out throughout the story. And we see throughout the last book, too, that Sita kind of has this ongoing almost romantic feeling for Matt, and a lot of that I think has to do with the fact that she knows that he's Yaksha's son, and so she's kind of allured by him because he has very much the same charismatic kind of pull to him that Yaksha did. But in this one, I don't believe Matt knows that Terry is no longer Terry. The only person that knows that Terry is actually Sita now is Simon, who we actually get to meet properly for the first time based on the end of the novellas in the last book. There was a whole thing about that. So again, if you haven't watched any of the reading vlog reviews I've done for this and you are sitting here confused, I would definitely go back and read the books and watch the reading vlog reviews because there is a lot of things that have happened up to this point. This is why this is like basically, I would say like the 8th book in the series, because it does pick up pretty much after all of the events of the novellas, but it does take its own storyline and has its own complications. So according to the synopsis on the back of this book, it says that Alyssa, or Sita, Alyssa is kind of her pseudonym that she uses, is a 5,000-year-old vampire, stronger and more cunning than her adversaries. But now she's trapped in the body of a newborn vampire and at the mercy of a terrible thirst. Worst of all, she's facing enemies whose fierce desire for domination grows ever stronger. I do remember that she did also turn Terry into a vampire prior to her death, which is why they say that she's a young vampire again. The immortal race, the Tellar, is threatening to release a virus to decimate humanity, which we also had learned about in the last book. But Alyssa and her friends can't take down the Tellar on their own, and they must turn to the mysterious organization, the IIC, for help, which is Bertrand's group. That's the IIC. But the IIC has secrets of its own and may have ulterior motives, something we've already known. With 2 rivals and no one to trust, Alyssa must rely on her dark side to defeat them, but it could cost her life or her soul. So this is essentially where like a lot of shit is going down. I don't remember really a lot of what goes on in particular with this one. I think that it was the last book in this series, which is the book after this one, that I had more vivid memories of things happening, but I thought the same with the last book in this series and even the last novella of the original series, and I was gravely mistaken because I didn't expect a lot of stuff to happen because I didn't remember as much as I thought I did. So I am basically going into this with almost like completely fresh eyes, completely new perspective. I will say that the last book I absolutely loved. I really liked it. I think I may have rated it a 5-star. I'm not mistaken. It might have been 4. I don't remember, but I'm really excited for this. So this particular copy has 496 pages worth of text. So this is, well, technically 492 in this edition, but this is likely going to be my last read for January because at the time I'm filming this, it's coming to the end of the Battle of the Bookish, and that ends on Sunday. So I think though that if I can really space my time out well, I should be able to hopefully finish this before the end of the month and use it for the Battle of the Bookish, because it is actually counting for one of my prompts for Battle of the Bookish to earn me some extra points. And I'm also listening to an audiobook right now that is also going to help with that. But this one I'm going to be spending a lot of time on, and I'm kind of excited because I want to know what happens, considering now that Sita is now Terry, and I think, like I said, Simon might be the only one so far that knows that. So we shall see how things develop. But I have to actually get into a meeting here real quick to discuss some stuff for my future, which involves me going back to school hopefully in the summer. So I will leave you here for now, and we will talk when I have made some major progress in this one. Hey y'all, so I didn't read at all last night because we ended up doing a lot of stuff around the house and I just didn't have a lot of time to sit and read, but today I did start with The Shadow of Death, and I'm on chapter 3 right now. I'm a little less than 30 pages. I'm on like page 28 basically. And first thing I want to talk about with this right now, because I wanted to wait until I had a point where I could like talk about what's going on, but now I gotta change my battery, so hold on one second. Okay, there we go. So, first thing I want to talk about is the fact that from the very beginning of the story, we know that it's basically taking off right at the point where we left off with in the last book. So, Sita basically continues to try to convince Seymour that she is Sita, but in Terry's body, all these things. And essentially what they come to discover is that, Sita has all of Terry's memories. She has all of her memories, so it's like she's still a part of her, but Seymour kind of describes it where she's like just taken over the personality, where like Terry's personality still might be there, might still have all the memories, but Sita's kind of overshadowing all of that, which makes sense to me because the way that, you know, I would think somebody going into another person's body would be kind of like, is that you would still have all of the memories, all of the things that would be from that previous soul's shell, in a sense. But Sita's the one that's in control. We don't really have any real telltale signs that Terry is the one that is still in there. Like, she has all the memories, but it's not necessarily shown as of yet in this at this point in the book where Terry is in any way trying to influence things happening, that kind of thing. So one of the other things though that we basically discover is that it's entirely possible that John had something to do, little baby John had something to do with this transference, because Sita says that she doesn't remember much about what happened in the transference, but she says somehow John was a part of it, which indicates to me that John is definitely a much bigger player in this whole story than we originally thought. I do remember that having been something that had happened at some point in the series, but at this point, we don't really know what his purpose is. In the last book, we basically had seen that he was playing this video game that essentially was you having this character that was trying to basically get on this spaceship to go off to another galaxy, which would basically be Endgame. And unfortunately, John could never really get past within like the first few levels of it because it's a very difficult game. It's all about like decision making and morals and all these different judgments and things that literally every time you play it, it changes. All we know about that is that it's called the CII. There is possibly some connection to that with either the Tellar or the IIC. We're not necessarily certain as of yet. Nothing on that end has really been divulged at this point. The next thing that we learn is that in the second chapter, we realize that because Terry is technically a new vampire, Sita is having all of the original hunger pains that she was when she was a very young vampire. It's almost as if she basically went back to square one. And so she's super sensitive to light. She has massive, massive hunger pains, which causes her to have to, unfortunately, kill somebody for the first time in this new body in order to feed. So very early on, she already gets herself into some trouble, and it's just not a good thing. And then from there, she goes, after killing and going to bury this body that she had killed, she gets back and Matt is there. And so we know that Matt doesn't really know anything about Sita being in Terry's body, but he knows that Terry is a new vampire, so likely he's not going to be super pissed at the fact that she had to feed, because that's something she has to do. But the fact that I think she hasn't said anything to him about it yet is going to make him a little irritated. But I'd be willing to bet that it's not going to be until much, much later we're going to have Matt find out that Terry is not Terry. And the way that Sita describes it is that she basically wants him to not know as long as she possibly can, because she believes that with the fact that Matt was so attached to Terry and already hated her for basically turning Terry into a vampire, that if he was to find out that Sita is the one that's in Terry's body, he would go fucking ballistic, which truthfully I would too if in that scenario. So that's kind of all we know at this point. But what I really appreciate about especially that second chapter is that we kind of get Sita back in a very vulnerable position. She doesn't have the same strength that she did in her old body. She's having to relearn all of these things essentially in this new body because it's no longer something that she's able to do. And at the end of the first chapter, she even talks about how she looks at her old body and realizes that Krishna is the one that essentially placed her in this new body because he has a purpose for her. She has a purpose to fulfill, which has to, I would believe, something to do with basically joining up, like we saw in the synopsis, where she has to join up with the IIC to take down the Tellar. And there is some history between Krishna and the Tellar. Like, the Tellar didn't really like Krishna. They didn't like that they got a lot of unanswered questions from him, things of that nature. What I really appreciate, though, like I said, is this fact that Sita now is in a point where she has to go back to square one. She has to basically be the most vulnerable being in this entire story because she can't tell anybody except Seymour that she is now Terry. And because she's in Terry's body, who's a newly turned vampire, everything is new again for her. She even has these moments of humanity a little bit because she's a new vampire, because when she goes to kill the person, that she feeds from, she starts to cry, and at this point she's not able to cry, just blood like she normally would. She's actually crying like watery tears because apparently after so long a vampire no longer has water, it's just blood in their bodies, unlike what we as humans have. So what I liked about that scene was like we kind of got some humanity again from Sita, indicating to me that with her being in this new body, she is very vulnerable. That vulnerability I think is going to be a major conflict within this story, because especially since she has all of Terry's memories, she probably is going to have a lot of Terry's judgment on things. She's going to have a lot of Terry's personality ebbing into this whole thing because she's kind of combined herself with Terry. So I would not be surprised if this is going to be a major conflict for her throughout this entire book, and that might be one of the hardest things for her to deal with, let alone all of the outside dangers that are going to be involved. I think this is going to be more of an internal battle she's going to have to deal with, which I'm really excited to see how that develops, because I don't know how she's going to deal with being kind of having Terry super involved in all of this, and then how her decisions are going to change based on the fact that Terry is involved in her body. So really interesting stuff. I'm excited to see what's going to happen next with it, but I'm kind of reading it on my breaks again as I've done, and I'm very busy with work otherwise, so I can't really talk for too much longer. But that's kind of just my initial thoughts with the first couple of chapters in terms of what I feel like this story is going to go for, and I'm actually really excited. I feel like this is going to be one of my more favorites in the series. So the Eternal Dawn, we ended up rating a 5-star. Yeah, that's what I thought. So I really liked that one, mostly because of the inclusion of Terry and all the different things that were involved with it. So I would not be surprised if this book, The Shadow of Death, would end up being a 4 or a 5-star, because I think that especially these full-length novels, they just get better. I feel like just like the whole series has gotten better as time goes on, because for one, Christopher Pike's writing got a lot better by the end of the novellas, and then the first full-length novel that we had was just really well done. I felt like it had all of the space it needed. It felt like it was a complete story, and even though it left on a bit of a cliffhanger, it still felt like we had a whole part of the story that was completed, and we couldn't really go further than that in a sense. But with this one, I think that this is going to have an ending where it might seem not quite complete, because something has to basically have us jump from this to the last book, and the last book was the one I thought was the most weird when I was in high school. So I'm a little concerned in the sense that that last book was the one I don't remember liking as much, because the overall ending was very confusing. However, knowing now ahead of time that the ending of that story makes more sense because of something that happened earlier in the books, I think that last book's going to fare a little bit better, but I'm still concerned as to how exactly we're going to go from the end of this one to how the last book's going to go, because I truthfully have no idea. I don't remember what the tie is between the books. I just now understand, with the other books in mind, that the ending of the last one is not necessarily as bad, because it does have an actual tie to something that happened earlier in the books. More specifically, I believe the last novella that was made before the first full-length novel. So that's all I'm going to say for right now. I'll come back and update when I have another thought that I would like to address if something important comes up, or at the very least, probably when I reach about 200 pages. I think that would be the next time I'd like to update, unless I have any other thoughts that come up over the course of this book. Hey guys, so it is quite a few days later, and I haven't really had a chance to update you all. Yesterday I did, though, read quite a bit of The Shadow of Death. I basically read, I would say, probably close to 60 pages. Yeah, I think like 60 pages. And all I can say now, we're over the 100-page mark at this point, so we're about a fifth of the way through the book. Last night, the last chapter I read was this chapter that talked a lot about what the array is and what exactly is the whole purpose with it. And I wasn't really going to go into specifics without spoiling it, but these reading vlog reviews are kind of spoilery, so I will go into it. First thing though, from where I started off yesterday, I ended up starting from chapter 5, so I only read like a couple chapters, but it was quite a bit. Basically, we first of all learned that the virus that the Tellar had tried to implement into the world in the last book, the vaccine that was used to cure everybody from it, like our main cast of characters, it's not seeming to work as well anymore. The idea is that the vaccine, because it was admitted after the virus was already in everybody's systems, it's more so just kind of masking the symptoms as opposed to fully curing people, which that is why a vaccine is a vaccine. A vaccine is supposed to prevent something from happening, whereas in this case it was used almost as like a medication, and so it's not working to its full potential. It also is modified more so for the Tellar, so it works for them more so than it probably will for the average human being. And there's also a lot of talk about what's kind of the next step, because now that they have, you know, escaped the Tellar for now, they have to figure out whether or not they're going to join the IIC and work with them. There's a lot of information they don't know about what's really going on, and so it's really important for them to figure out what is going on so they can go into this whole thing with like a good, you know, standing. Then in chapter 6, we find out, you know, who all is involved in the IIC. We find out, you know, everyone that's involved with it, and we do find out information about the fact that the IIC was basically started off as a graduate program that was through UC Berkeley under the leadership of this parapsychology professor named John Sharp. He was kind of obsessed with the idea of ESP and how, you know, this could affect, you know, all these things, which could play into the whole IIC's idea of using possibly psychic individuals to determine things that are happening on the stock market, which is how they make their money. And then from there, we're also kind of having to still deal with the fact that Terry, Sita now, basically had accidentally killed somebody that was a person in the hotel that they were staying at, and so you know, she's obviously got a tail on her kind of thing, and that's basically a lot of what the 6th chapter is about, is like the interview, and then Terry having to once again go out, Terry/Sita having to once again go out and feed, and having to essentially steal a bunch of blood from a blood bank that is ran by this woman who is one of the detective's wives, and so that kind of like has its own massive issues, just kind of continuously bringing up the fact that Sita now as Terry has to like relearn how to do everything. It even seems like Sita's brain is not fully a part of this body, like Terry is the one more so having to make the decisions, because it literally feels like Sita is a brand new vampire, and even though she had learned in 5,000 years how to effectively obtain blood and feed on people, Terry doesn't know how to do that yet. So it's more of like how Terry is the one in control of the body, and she's the one that is having to experience having to get all of this blood, whereas if it was Sita running the whole show, you know, fully, she would know exactly what to do. So it's kind of this whole imagery for me of like a baby deer on ice, where she's kind of trying to like find her footing almost now in this new body, even though she has all of the memories and all of the knowledge of a 5,000-year-old vampire. It is such an interesting kind of juxtaposition that I really enjoy reading. And then in chapter 7, we do end up meeting Professor Sharp, and we learn everything about the array, what it was intended for, and we also learn about this other thing that may come into play that's called the cradle, which apparently Sita has already, and actually Terry, have already come into contact with, which is possibly what happened in the last book when Sita ended up accidentally killing one of the Tellar people in like a really brutal manner, and also likely what caused Matt to try to kill Sita kind of thing, and ultimately doing so. So we learn a lot about the IIC in terms of like how John was really interested in ESP, and how he was doing a lot of academic research involved in it, and how he eventually did find out that, you know, there is some statistical evidence that sometimes there are people who have kind of more of an ESP tendency, because they will get some things right sometimes when it comes to like trying to determine like a set of cards, like what is on the card. One of the most famous ESP studies that there has ever been, and I think it's actually something that many of you would remember if you watched the first Ghostbusters movie back from the 80s, is the idea that somebody with ESP, when you hold up a card that has one of 5 symbols on it, you can determine what that symbol is, even though you can't see the card and you have no ability to know what is on that card. It's a study that's basically been around for a long time and has kind of been one of the introductory phases of understanding ESP and parapsychology and all these things. And so Sharp goes into this whole thing of like how he was kind of conducting these massive experiments on large scales to like figure out how people were possibly able to determine these, how often they were able to get these cards right, kind of thing. And tells everybody that basically the array is not so much a machine, and how it's more of like a group of people who have ESP tendencies that are all kind of working in conjunction that power something, whether it is a machine itself, like using kind of the brainwave activity or whatever. That's not necessarily as clear. And then he basically goes into how further what basically created the IIC was all of the people in the graduate program looking to go into the stock market and using the array to determine stock market, ups and downs and all these things. And Sharp didn't necessarily agree with it. He didn't necessarily think that this was what needed to be done, but having had a stroke at one point, he was removed from the program, and so Cindy Brutrin and her husband, Tom, and all the other people involved in the graduate program ended up just taking it over and creating their own thing, which became the IIC. Now, he also goes into this whole thing about how the array basically works. And how essentially one of the people involved in the IIC named Freddie, who was like massively into like LSD and mushrooms and all these things, he was able to like extract information from the people of the array. And Sharp says, it was more along the lines of spiritualism. The type of people drawn to those cults are always trying to get messages from beyond the grave. They gather people around a table and try to get the table's legs to tap once for yes and twice for no, or else they sit with Ouija boards and channel all kinds of bizarre information. Freddie was drawn to that sort of thing. It impressed me that he was able to adapt our arrays so the power of a large group could contribute to what was being channeled, but once again the quality of the information was usually poor. So he basically tried to use this array of people to get some kind of psychic ability or, draw on energies and understand like what those were, kind of thing. It was no different from the junk you could find in 100 channeled books at the store. A spirit would arrive with some high-sounding name and profess to have the secrets of the universe. He or she would dictate pages of information on reincarnation or higher dimensions, none of which could be tested. I'm telling you, it was a waste of time. And he says that we were trying to tap into a power that had no name. Some people might have called it God. I'm not sure what I would have been one of them. And he says that he thinks that originally it was to be used for evil purposes, but he's not even sure what exactly it was, because he says that the arrays were designed to solicit information to prove we had hidden senses beyond the 5 obvious ones, didn't create it to hurt people. Basically, Sharp doesn't really know what the array has been being used for years. He kind of has been out of the loop of everything, and he never intended it to be this big bad thing, which is then why he brings up the cradle, because the cradle seems to be something that is a lot more dangerous and is probably what, like I said, was used against not only Sita in the last book when she had killed off that Teller character. It's likely also what was used against Matt to then kill Sita, which ended up then also in a sense killing Terry, because Terry also was just super weak and wasn't able to transform into a vampire as effectively, and then that is how exactly like those two people ended up switching bodies. Now, I don't think the cradle necessarily was the ultimate thing for them to switch bodies, but it definitely is the reason as to why Sita was killed, so that then causing this shift between Sita and Terry's body and Terry's soul being like somewhere else, possibly still in the same body, possibly not, kind of thing. So that's basically all we've learned at this point, is that there obviously is something much more darker going on with what the IIC has been doing, but it is obviously something that the Tellar are interested in as well, which means the Tellar are looking to understand what this whole contraption is and what its purposes are and how they can get a hold of it to use for their own purposes. I will say that I feel like this is all, obviously because it's another full-length novel, the chapters are getting longer, but I still feel like the writing style has been consistent because it's easy to fly through. You don't realize you've read about 30 pages because it just feels like it moves so quickly and easy to understand, easy to kind of like comprehend everything that's going on. So I think that that is one of the things I love most about this series, is especially once, you know, you get through like the first couple of books where like you're getting used to the writing style, it does remain consistent in the sense that like you're not feeling like it's dragging on, you're not feeling like it's taking more time than it needs to. It just feels like it's very centered and, you know, grounded in its writing style, where you really get to appreciate how quick the story does move, even for a full-length novel like this. So hello everybody, it is a couple days later, I think, from the last time I spoke to you. It is now February 3rd, it's about 8:45 in the evening, and I have reached about page 200 so far in The Shadow of Death. Chapter 8, we find out, you know, the gang is basically going to find Frederick Wilde, who is the guy Freddy that was mentioned that was like super into like LSD and mushrooms and all of that. He apparently was this like one of the first psychics they found within their group, and he was a part of the original construction of the IIC, was involved with Sandy Bertrand at one point, and so they basically go to find him in San Mateo, and he lives with his girlfriend Mary. And when they get there, they already know that the two of them know about the group coming to see them, because Professor Sharp had given them a bit of a heads up, and essentially they learn a lot more about what exactly the array is, how it got started, all these things. Freddy's a little kind of apprehensive to talk about it all, though, because you find out a little bit later in the story like that he had a lot to do with the construction of the array, and then also the cradle that was created, and he feels really, really bad about a lot of it because it wasn't his intention for things to be used the way they were, but Cindy had basically taken everything and made it into like a monster kind of thing. So Freddy basically goes into, like, with Mary's kind of help talking about it, how he kind of like went through the whole meeting of everybody, and basically the 8th chapter is them really just kind of starting to get to know Mary and Freddy, and Freddy's not really talking a lot, but they say that like they'll stay the night, you know, and hopefully the next day he'll be more willing to talk. Chapter 9 is more about something that kind of was brought up in the last book that's getting brought up again, which is this book that Yaksha had created that was meant for only certain people to see, one of them being Sita, and basically Sita wants to like read it again because she's trying to find out more about Umara, who was Yaksha's lover and is Matt's mother, and wanting to kind of figure out more about her and why she, you know, how they met and all these things, but the book doesn't really say anything about it. However, she knows that that might be because Yaksha was trying to hide information from like the Tellar and the IIC that it would be used against him. So she does find a way to actually find out that information, which is basically to like throw her blood on the pages, and, you know, then it's like an invisible ink of sorts that comes up. And so she learns about how he met Umara years and years and years ago, and how they got to be, you know, brought together in life. Chapter 10 then from there goes more into Sita having to contact a couple different people as Terry, one of them being Lisa Fetch, who in the last book was a character that was being targeted by the IIC because she knows all of the information about the IIC. She doesn't know exactly specifics, but she has enough dirt on them to see that, you know, they are people that are dangerous, because not only did they kill an ex-boyfriend of hers, they did end up killing her boyfriend that she had in the last book, because of her involvement with the IIC. And from there, we learn there's another child within the array similar to Shanti who is like super, super powerful in terms of his psychic power. And then we also have Sita giving a call to Terry's parents to talk to them about how things are going. And Terry's parents basically say that the cops are still after her. They're actually looking to talk to her because there's been developments in the case of the hotel employee that was killed. And the detective basically says that Terry's no longer being looked at as a suspect for his death, but there's also this unrelated incident where somebody thought that they had seen Terry at the scene where she had stolen all the blood, which technically she was, but they don't have any proof on it. Sita, though, gets kind of pissed about it because it's not something she really wants to deal with. She's kind of having to, still focus on what's going on with, figuring out about the IAC and all these things. So she basically just is like, I'm not dealing with this right now. You guys have no evidence against me, like, see ya bye kind of thing. And then she does get a hold of Matt, who doesn't know still that Terry is not Terry, that Terry is actually Sita, and she talks to him about all of the things that are going on and, these things, and she's trying to learn also about how the construction of the new vaccine is, because the new vaccine is supposed to hopefully help Shanti and Seymour end up, being healed from the virus that they were basically infected with, and he tells her a little bit about how that goes, all that stuff. Then we get to chapter 11, where we learn everything there is to know about the array, and then also the cradle, which is a whole other entity that kind of was birthed because of the array itself. And basically we learned that Freddie unfortunately had caused a member of their team to have a heart attack unintentionally, but he had become so aggravated at this person because this person, Tom, who is now Cindy's husband, at the time while Cindy and Freddie were together, there was a rumor saying that Tom was caught kissing Cindy, and it made Freddie so pissed off that it actually caused him to give Tom a heart attack, which was unintentional, but it did show the professor that there is a possibility for you to use the array with Freddie as kind of the conduit to cause any kind of number of various things to happen. And then he talks about how the cradle came into existence through that. And after all of that happened, Cindy and Freddie had a child. They had a boy they named Henry. And Henry unfortunately had, I don't know what the condition is, but it's a physical condition where like the baby basically had several organs that were outside of the body. Like they had to have do surgery on the baby to put the organs and stuff back in. Unfortunately, it didn't go well. The baby did die, and Freddie, though, had known a little bit about astrological kinds of things, which perked my interest a lot because I'm learning more about astrology and all these things. And he found out that unfortunately that baby was literally doomed to die. He says that he ended up looking at his birth chart and says that he had Mars in his 8th house, which is the house of loss, and Mars is the planet of death. And both of those things, Mars and his 8th house, were both in Scorpio, which gives great power to a negative influence. And he was also born on a solar eclipse, which basically meant this kid was just doomed to never really live and just die at like not even a week old. And so he basically realized that through extensive research, he could predict why people were in the positions they were, and it was all based on their astrological birth charts. Based on when they were born, they were destined to be involved in certain things, which, if you know anything about astrology and people who are astrologists and, astrology interpreters, things of that nature where they talk about how your houses affect how you are as people, kind of things, that is like the whole basis of their stuff. They don't necessarily pinpoint what exactly your successful careers will be, but based on your birth chart, you can kind of determine how a person is and what kind of their personality is from that. And so it goes into this whole thing. And so basically, this is where the cradle was basically born, because with this information, Cindy stole it from Freddie, and instead of using it to maybe combine all of the powers of the most important and greatest people that there would be in the world, she used it to basically get all of the worst people in the world, people with like the most negative outlooks on life that were bitter and angry and all these things, and use them in the array to cause harm to other people. So that kind of whole thing is what exactly led to the array and the cradle that is now in this story at the time. And they apparently have another daughter. Freddie and Cindy did have a daughter named Jolie, who had happened at some point after all of this, because they were still together for a long time. They had never really gotten married, but they were still together for a very long time. And the only reason that Freddie knows as much as he does about what is going on with the IIC is that he still has a kind of like friendship with Cindy, and he does know that Cindy has tried to use the array on him because he nearly killed his girlfriend Mary, because he had lost complete control of himself, which, if you remember what happened in the last book, that's basically how Sita had died and how Terry basically had died. So we learn everything about that, and then chapter 12 is a chapter where we find out that Mary is actually Umara, who is Matt's mother, Yaksha's lover. We find that out, and we also learn that Umara had actually taken Sita's body from the grave that she was buried in and has been like preserving her body and trying to protect her body because she knows that Sita is meant to be in this body in order for her to then be able to take down the Talar and the IIC and cause some things to keep from happening that would basically destroy the entire world. And she knows that Matt does not know that Terry is not Terry, and so like there's this whole conversation of how they're going to bring that up to him and basically get Sita's soul out of Terry's body and put it back in Sita's body so that she can actually be in her old body again, because the body itself has actually started to heal with all of the preservation that it had gone through over the last couple weeks, basically. So that's kind of what the whole thing is. And then chapter 13 is pretty much Matt and Sita's first interaction with Matt now knowing that Terry is not Terry and that she is actually Sita, and it does not go over very well. He is livid, but I think it's more so he's grieving because now he knows that Terry is actually pretty much gone. She's not going to come back. Her soul is basically gone, and while Sita has all of the memories of Terry, it's not the same. Like, we basically learn from the chapter of Umara that Terry's not really there. Terry is gone forever, and the only reason that Sita has her memories is because she's in her body, and so she has like her physical brain, and so it has still all of the memories there, but it's Sita that's really there. And unfortunately, when this whole ritual happens where Umara is going to help try to send Sita's soul from Terry's body into her own body, it's going to basically cause Terry to then finally be gone forever. And that is really hard on Matt. That's really hard on Sita because it's kind of this moment that they didn't think was going to happen, and it's just, it's kind of heartbreaking because, like, you know how much that Matt loves Sita, but loves so much more Terry and how much, like, love he had in his body for her. And you also understand that basically how the last book went, how much that Sita cared for Terry. Terry was a descendant of hers. So, of course, she, like, became infatuated with her in the time she got to know her and all these things. And it's just so hard because, especially losing somebody that you're so very close to, especially like if you love them like you're their partner or you're their family, like it's just so hard to like let that go. And you always have, like, especially in this scenario, you have that hope that Terry can somehow come back, but in your deepest part of your heart you know that she can't, because she's gone. There's no way for her to come back. There's no way to bring her back, and you don't want to believe it because it's too heartbreaking to think about. But that is the reality of the scenario, is that she is not going to come back, and no matter how much they want her to, no matter how much they try to think that she can come back. She's not going to. And I think that kind of moment that Matt and Sita have where they get really like pissed at each other and start blaming each other for what happened, and when Matt, threatens to kill her, and a line Sita says is, "That's not true. You can fool yourself, but you can't fool Terry. You're right. Part of her does still live inside me. Her memories are all there, and I have only to glance at the day you met her and the days that followed to know that you were constantly battling with yourself whether it was right for you to let her fall in love with you. Well, you convinced yourself that the answer was yes when it was no. No, Matt, I'm no more to blame than you for what happened to her. So if you decide to rip my head off, please be a sport about it and end your own life when you're done with me." It kind of broke me because it is very much like they're in the same position. Neither of them want Terry to be gone. Neither of them want her to fully die. But to continuously blame each other for what happened when in reality it was just both their faults in general, that is kind of a harsh reality to kind of come around to. I think that what I love about these full-length novels is that I think that we get to explore the humanity of these characters, especially Sita, so much more than we did in the novellas that were published originally. I feel like with this one in particular, because Sita is so vulnerable being in Terry's body, she is becoming more humanized. And we already kind of had seen that over the course of the series, but now that she's in this brand new body, this spring chicken body basically, where she has to start completely over and doesn't have any of the same instincts that she did when she was in her old body, like, it really brings her back and kind of humbles her in a lot of ways, because she understands that she took, I think, a lot of what she had for granted, her experience, her, instinct that she had developed over literal thousands of years. She took a lot of that for granted, I think, and you kind of see that as she kind of goes through her having to feed and having to, like, find a way to have a supply of blood so she can, stay kind of sane. And, just the kind of humanity aspect of that, like how somebody, even when they've gone through so much and they've experienced so much, how sometimes there's still so many things that can bring them down to their fucking knees. And I love that because I think we had seen so much throughout this series of Sita being the strong one and having to be the badass, and we didn't really get a lot of time seeing her in such a vulnerable position, which is why I wish the other books in the series had been full-length novels. But that's not how it went. That's not how the story, came out, and I guess it was for a reason, but I feel like I'm so much more happy seeing a full-length novel fully explore these things about Sita's character and about how she's grown and what she's kind of, like, learned and her interactions with these characters that I think means so much to her. It makes my heart happy to see that the full-length novels are exactly what I knew they could have been if the other books had been made into full-length novels, if that makes sense. So, hello all, it is a couple days later and I have just reached the 300-page mark in The Shadow of Death. I'm going to go over again, like I have been the last several chapters. I'm going to say these last 100 pages were some of the heaviest in terms of information. So I will say that I think a lot of people around this part of the book, which is about the middle part of the book, will probably find it to be very info dumpy, because like I had said with going and talking to Professor Sharp and with Freddie, there's a lot of information that gets brought up that you have to, like, sift through. Like, it's kind of one of those things where it's so hard to not spend 30 pages on a chapter because it contains so much information of what exactly these things are happening are, and what exactly are things happening that relate to what has happened in the past, all these things. So I will understand if a lot of people reading this book and this part of it would get really aggravated with the info dumpiness, but I feel like there's just no other way that you could have gone about talking about all of these things, because Sita is literally finding all of these things out as she goes, and so it's kind of okay for me. I'm not as upset by, like, all of the info dumpiness as I probably would have been with other books, because I feel like this just doesn't really have any other opportunity to have all of that. So starting off on chapter 14, we go through the ritual of Sita actually being placed back in her own body, because as I said in the last clip, we find out Umara is basically able to take the soul of Sita trapped in Terry's body and put it back into her own body. Now, that does come with some pretty grievous costs, one of which being that Terry ultimately will die finally, and she will not come back. And unfortunately, one of the ways that they have to cause this ritual to happen is they do have to break the leg that Terry had damaged when she was originally dying, before Sita's soul had inhabited her body. So there's basically that. That's basically the whole chapter, is her going through the ritual. Chapter 15 goes into Sita now in her real body, having been in her real body now for a little less than a day, a little less than 2 days actually. She goes to the IIC to confront Bertrand once again, and essentially wants her to help them with taking down the Tellar. However, in order for her to do that, she has to threaten them by basically infecting everybody with the virus and saying, if you don't help me, you're all gonna die, basically. And with all of that, she makes like a list of demands. Basically, she wants Bertrand to help her take down the Tellar. She wants to get involved with the Array and the Cradle and see what all of this actually is. Chapter 16, we actually learn a lot about why Bertrand is the leader of the IIC, why exactly she got so involved with the Array and the Cradle. And you learn that it's because when, like I said earlier, her and Freddie's child had unfortunately died because he was destined to die, she basically went through this entire, like, depression. She wouldn't show it on the outside, but she was massively hurting. And when especially Freddie was able to find this communication with the Array and find that there was this spirit that was kind of, you know, connecting to all of the kids that were working as the Array, she thought that through that she would get some answers as to why her son was not able to live, why he had to die at such, like, barely a week old. And when that did not provide any answers for her, she just became very bitter and power hungry and all these things, because she wanted to take that control basically back. It's a very, very clear thing where she was hurting so much that she basically let everything kind of encompass her, which is not necessarily an excuse, I think, by any means, because Bertrand is like this evil woman, but it does bring to light some of the issues that kind of happen with, you know, why certain villains become how they are. And so, like, it's not necessarily excusable, but it is what happened to her that did cause a lot of what she has done at this point. And she kind of thinks that the Cradle is like, it's its own entity. Like, she no longer really has control over all of it, because it got to a point where it just became its own thing. And with the messages that were coming in from what they were calling familiars, or basically the spirits or entities that were kind of communicating with the Array, with the children involved in it, one of which being her own daughter, who she, you know, also had with Freddie, but says it was her husband Tom's child, kind of thing. Their daughter Jolie is like probably one of the scariest 5-year-olds I've ever met, because she is essentially the epitome of evil. Like, she is a devil child in her own right, because of when she was born and her power and her ability to connect with the Array and all of these things. Then she goes into this whole thing about one of the entities they speak with that she calls Tarana. And Tarana is a word that in basically ancient Egyptian means light or brilliant, and the individual symbols for each of the syllables, ta, ra, na, means light bearer. And in the last book, there was this devil character that came up when Sita was killing that one Tellar individual that called themselves the Light Bearer. And if you know anything about the Bible, the Light Bearer is basically a name for Lucifer, or like the devil, the fallen angel, you know, that kind of guy. So there's kind of this idea that maybe Lucifer or the devil is involved in this, and there's demons involved that are kind of connecting to the Array, and that could lead to a lot of the reason why there's a lot of negative energy. There's a lot of like evil power that's being used with the Array, because essentially the way they've built it is projecting negative energy and causing bad things to happen. And so it's a lot of like, this whole chapter is a lot of like Bertrand basically talking about how the array works. What is it that she's learned over the course of time with working with the array and the cradle and all of these things. She talks about how Tarana became her focal point of her research, because the array would channel Tarana's energy exclusively. His knowledge was breathtaking. He taught me simple herbal formulas and physical and mental exercises to halt the aging process, which is something that we have this question about, because Bertrand should be like in her 60s or 70s, but she looks like she's still in her maybe mid 30s, and so it's kind of this weird phenomenon that we now understand how exactly she got to do it. She says that he also gave her lessons in management, and the IIC was organized under the light bearer's directions. And Sita doesn't really know if she really believes any of this. She's kind of skeptical of everything because it doesn't seem like it's real. It doesn't seem like this all could possibly really be happening. But Sita, I think, is just in a lot of denial because she's not able to understand exactly what's happening. Like, it's almost too much information for her to really get a grasp on. So then Cindy goes into saying how she has lost control, and there's kind of this subset of the array called the lens, which is what creates the cradle. Like, they are the ones that control what the cradle is, and it's kind of like this subset of everybody that is involved in the array, because the array is made up of like thousands of kids, and then a small percentage of them make up what's called the lens, which is kind of a focal point to then use the cradle. And she says that she's not sure if it's Tarana or the kids that are involved with all of this, because it's whatever stands over the kids when they gather to invoke the cradle. It's that power or those beings that have taken over. And so Bertrand basically just kind of continues with everything that's going on. She knows that basically the cradle is dangerous. She knows her daughter, for instance, is really dangerous, and she's one of the ones involved in the lens. She actually goes into a story of how when her daughter was 3 years old, she wanted to stay up at night, like all night, and watch TV, and when Cindy had told her no, Jolie basically like maimed her own mother. So she basically wants to help Sita with what's going on, but she also wants Sita to help her with taking down the Tellar, obviously, and also possibly destroying the cradle, which could end up meaning destroying her own daughter, because Cindy, while she is this power-hungry woman, does have a conscience in some capacity. Chapter 17, we actually get to see Sita get involved with the cradle. She actually has to create a blood sacrifice, which ends up killing off Lisa Fetch, who she thinks is a mole in her group, that she believes has been pushing information to Cindy throughout their entirety of their, thing. Turns out that that's not true, and she actually just kills Lisa. She's an innocent. She uses her as a blood sacrifice without actually having any real purpose behind it, and she doesn't know that, though, until going through the ritual. And Sita, through all of that, gains a familiar who is actually one of the strongest familiars, probably is the one entity that is the one leading everything at this point. And that is not good, because that does, we see in the next chapter, really affect her whole existence, her whole ability to use her powers. We see that does have some major impact on all of that. Then chapter 18 is the aftermath of that. We do see Sita go back to Umara and talk with her about what exactly happened, and we learn a lot of information about the Tellar, how they came to be, how they got their power, their connection with this thing that they call the Source, which is their own version of the array, and what exactly gave them the ability to, one, become immortal, and also a little bit as to why the Tellar may have exactly lost their way, which is something that they have been talking about as like something that they have been trying to figure out, because it's something that Krishna had said to Yaksha at one point that we learned about in the last book, is that Krishna believes that the Tellar have lost their way, that they had this great power, this great ability to live forever, be immortal. But through that, they basically lost their purpose, they lost their way. And I think Umara really brings up a lot of how that happened. So one of the other things, though, that we do learn is that, obviously with Terry now being dead, Matt had to go to the funeral of Terry, and it's a big tragedy. He doesn't know, like, really how to feel now that he's kind of really lost now the love of his life. And so with that, Sita then also calls up one of the detectives that was after her to try and like make things right now that she has her real powers. And this is where the familiar comes in and affects almost how something happens, because when she tries to talk to the detective to like wipe his mind of everything that happened the night that she went to attack them and gain blood, the familiar almost makes its little fingers get into the pot a little bit, because the detective basically says there's some weird feeling he's got that it's not normal. It's not something he recognizes with Sita being there already. So she already sees that the familiar is actually trying to take over in a sense, and it's going to be very hard for her, I think, to know how to combat that, because for one, she just gained this familiar. It's not something she knows how to control as of yet. But then also, what does that mean in terms of how her abilities are going to be used in the future, with especially like hypnosis and persuasion and all of these things? That's going to possibly cause some major problems for her in the future. And the most important aspect of this chapter, and kind of I think where really we see a lot of this info dumpiness that I think a lot of people would not be okay with, is about the Tellar, how they came to be, what exactly they did to become immortal, all of these things. Because Sita basically asks how exactly to Amara how the Tellar were able to create something like the array for themselves when they had none of the technology at that time, because this is back in like ancient Egypt, like thousands of years ago, before modern technology was kind of around. So she asked the question of, you know, how is it that this kind of more primitive culture of sorts was able to have their own version of the array that they call the source. So she goes through the entire thing, starting with how she originally was not a priest of any kind, or she was not like, you know, involved with the Tellar. Like, she was not necessarily involved in like the leadership aspect of it. Her father was really more the one involved in it, and then he brought her in when she became a lot older. They were a very religious group. The Tellar were a very religious individual group where they focused a lot on meditation and songs and hymns and mantras and that kind of thing. And they would have these moments where after each hymn or mantra or whatever, they would sit in silence, because the enjoyment of that silence kind of brought them back to, you know, enjoying the world they live in. They were very much a religious group that focused on how silence is like a really big part, letting, you know, the world speak its language, in terms of, you know, letting yourself be silent to observe the world, observe how nature works, and then, you know, being appreciative of that. So eventually, though, she talks about how in those moments of silence, eventually the group got to a point where a percentage of them would start speaking in tongues. And Sita talks about how it's kind of like a Pentecostal almost thing, which I know nothing about Pentecostal religious practices, but I guess they must have some kind of like, when they get really involved with, you know, stuff that they're doing with prayer, like they start speaking in tongues. I don't know anything about that. I don't know if that's actually, you know, credible or whatever, but basically the Tellar would start making these sounds, these kinds of noises that eventually were able to be construed as a language. They were able to actually like start piecing things together, and it started off as like a small group of them, and then eventually almost the entirety of the Tellar were able to do this, and they were able to find this way of communication that they believe was from the spirits above, with, you know, that they were kind of communicating through them in a sense. They say that basically with all of that, they were able to learn how to survive as people, talking about how they were able to sterilize their milk and their water by boiling it, how to build aqueducts to channel the water from the Nile so they could grow 10 times as many crops, how to build a thresher to separate the wheat kernels from the stalks. Like, they were these kinds of communications that they were developing, they thought were from the spirits, and that was how they were able to learn how to make these kind of more primitive technologies in a sense. Eventually, though, what they ended up doing was being able to then find a way of how to extend their life, because through the source they were able to learn how to, similar to what the array had showed the IIC, you know, they were able, pretty much the same things almost, they were able to find a way to extend their lives through herbs and yoga practices and meditation practices and all of these things. Mara basically says that the secret of the Tellar's immortality came from the link, which is like the lens that the array has. It's kind of the same thing. The link was kind of the subset of people that were the most in tune with what the source was talking about, and Umara was one of them along with her father. And she says that the secret was that a great white light came and blessed them. She says that the link grew in power with the passing years. As a group, we aged very slowly. We were together perhaps 100 years when we had a great breakthrough. We were sitting in silence in our largest pyramid. We had been fasting on nothing but water for weeks, and our physical bodies felt as if they were made of air. Yet our link kept growing stronger and stronger, and with it we were able to peer into realms you can't imagine. Prophets speak of angels and archangels and elementals and gods, but we actually saw such beings. We were able to communicate with them, learn from them, and at each step we were led higher and higher. Eventually we reached a point where we believed we might one day see God. And then that was when the light basically came to them. She says that the glory and power of it has never left me. It's possible it's the same light the Bible refers to when it speaks of the Holy Spirit. I only know that after it came and left, all of us in the link and the majority of others who were able to contact the source were immortal. And then she goes into kind of how essentially from this massive amount of power, people started to become corrupted. Her father ended up becoming the leader of the Tellar, and unfortunately, because they were all so hungry for power and wanting this light again and wanting to be bathed in this light for eternity, people started actually becoming corrupt. This kind of power made people go basically insane, I guess, or, something to that extent where they just became evil and power hungry. And unfortunately, Umara witnessed her father being killed by a man named Hatram, who then raped and wanted to kill her because she was also, of the mindset that they need to be back to what they used to be. And we learned that that rape that she experienced is actually what brought Haru. Because if you remember in the last book, Haru is now the leader of the Tellar currently. And Umara had said that Haru was her brother. But come to find out, Haru is actually her son. He is the product of the rape she had endured, and he is also Matt's half-brother. Haru is the one, though, that has wanted Umara and Matt dead for years. And so it's kind of this really weird thing that, Sita's like, whoa, that's a lot of baggage, basically. Like, I didn't expect that to come out of your mouth, kind of thing. She basically tells Umara, she's like, if I take down the Tellar, he's gonna be killed. Are you okay with me killing Haru? And literally Umara is like, it's like when I killed his father. It was necessary. I don't care. I don't care for Haru. Like, Haru is an evil, evil being. Like, kill him. I don't give a shit. And then so the end of the chapter, we see Sita go back to Bertrand and talk a little bit about her experience with the cradle. And essentially she does kind of empathize with Bertrand. She does say that she understands how she lost control, but she shouldn't have put herself that spot in the first place. Like, it is ultimately her fault that she went through all this, because she didn't have to be put in this position, but she did. And then the end of the chapter is her reading about the idea of the Hydra, which has been kind of a running theme throughout this whole book, because with taking down the Tellar, like, it's going to be incredibly difficult, just like with how the story of the Hydra is with Hercules. You kill one head, 3 more are going to pop up or whatever, and it's going to be nearly impossible. And so in reading Yaksha's book, she reads the story of the Hydra that Krishna had it was a quote from Krishna about talking about the Hydra. And she understands now that through this quote, Krishna was telling Yaksha at the time how there's Iolaus and Hercules, Iolaus being kind of the mentor, the one that is kind of the one that is supposed to help Hercules through his journey, even though he seems like he's just more so somebody helping him out, kind of a thing. And Krishna basically is telling to Yaksha that Yaksha is the one that's going to have to go through and actually kill the Hydra. But he's not going to be actually able to do it. He's not going to be really able to do it. He's only going to be able to kind of tamper them down and all of these things, like with how Iolaus tells Hercules that he is going to, unfortunately, be the one that is going to have to kill the Hydra, but he's not going to be able to kill the Hydra. He's going to only be able to kind of like tamper it down. And there's also a connection back to Krishna, where Krishna and Arjuna, who are, prevalent people in Hindu mythology, Krishna being, like I said before, the Jesus Christ of this mythology, and Arjuna being his cousin. Krishna was kind of the one that was supposed to be helping him in a sense, like Iolus was, but he ends up being more so the mentor, more so being the one that is like, yo, dude, you gotta go do this, but you're not really going to be able to do it, kind of thing. So there's a lot that delves into like how this is going to be such a very difficult thing, and obviously Yaksha's dead now. He's not able to do it. So Sita's the one that's going to have to do it. That's been the last 100 pages. So like I said, these last 100 pages, and probably even more so in the last section of this, was a lot of info dumping. And like I said, I think that there's no way to go about this. There's no way to swerve around all of this info dumping, because unfortunately, it's just, she's learning shit as she goes. She is coming across information as she goes, and it's just kind of unavoidable, because it's either she spends, 30 pages talking to somebody about specifically something that happened, or it doesn't come up at all, and we are left with all of these questions. So I understand though how so many people reading this would be like, oh my god, it's just sifting through all of this bullshit, all of this history and theory and all of these things that doesn't really have, to be this long. I think though that, in my opinion, you gotta sift through the bullshit to get more of what the story is going for, and how exactly Sita takes in that information, and how she sits with it, and how she's able to come up with a plan with all of that knowledge. And truthfully, she's overwhelmed. You can tell she's very overwhelmed with all of this information kind of just being thrown at her within like the span of like 20 minutes. It's kind of like mind-boggling. Like, you feel how overwhelmed she gets, because you are kind of overwhelmed with all the information, which I think more so lends to the reason as to why all of this has to be unpacked right now. We now have a little less than 200 pages left of this story. The book is 492 pages long, so I have about 190 pages left before the end of this. Do I think I can finish it today? Definitely not. Not on this day in particular, because I have to stream tonight, and there's going to be so many other things that will be happening probably today. But I do think that if I don't finish this today, I definitely can finish it tomorrow, because I'm not really doing anything tomorrow other than going to go get groceries, likely with Robert. So I have this idea where I kind of want to maybe do a 24-hour readathon where I'm going to read not only this, but a few other books afterward. But basically tomorrow I would be able to wrap this book up finally. So I will see all of you guys tomorrow, where I'm gonna wrap up the last couple hundred pages of this book, and we're gonna talk about the whole of it. I'm gonna say now, I definitely think that it's gonna be at least a 4-star, because I really love a lot of what this story has been doing. I love learning everything there is to know now about the IIC and Bertrand and the Tellar and all of these things. It really depend on how the ending is for me, for it to be a 4 or a 5-star, but nonetheless, I am very excited to see how this whole thing goes. Hey guys, so it is now actually more about 20 minutes after 4 in the morning now on Saturday. I have started my 24-hour readathon at midnight and had a monster basically leading up to that, starting at like 10 o'clock or so, so I'm still kind of riding on that. Probably though we'll be going to bed after this, because I am noticing I'm getting like kind of tired, but I'm gonna go over the last couple hundred pages of The Shadow of Death before I do. So I'm gonna say now though, in terms of what I think the ending of the story was like, I think that this book's gonna get a 4-star, because I feel like the end of this story, it was fine. I think that the plot threads were mostly picked up and everything. It kind of just felt like there were some things that I'll get to later that seemed a little strange. I think it more so just caught me off guard more than anything, and because of that, I don't think I was as much of a fan of how the story had went, but I think that it's still really good. I think that it's just maybe also with a lot of the info dumpiness that happened in this book, I feel like it, just kind of bogged down the story a little bit. I don't quite know. I don't think it is a 5-star book. I think that it's really good. I think there's a lot of great things that I've already talked about it, and that I will continue to talk about with the last several chapters of this. But I just cannot in my heart give it a 5-star because something about it is not necessarily what I would expect for something that would be a 5-star for this series. So chapter 19, we basically have Sita go through and using the cradle again to now target 2 people that are involved in the Tellar. It's the first kind of instance we're actually seeing the Tellar be targeted by the cradle and how that goes, all these things. And then also we learn that they are going to start administering the vaccine to everybody in the IIC that was infected with the X6 virus, which is the virus the Tellar had created to wipe out most of humanity. And then we also find out that in terms of the computer program that little baby John, now 16-year-old John, had been playing, the CII, there is this very distinct pattern of things that happen where in kind of parts of the game when you're going through the battles, there is this mantra that is kind of played. It's kind of hidden and you'd only be able to hear it based on like using binaural beats and all these things. Like it's very technical how they go through the whole thing, but basically it repeats the mantra that they use, the cradle uses in order to invoke the spirits, the familiars, in order to use the cradle. And they go through like a whole like info dump basically of how this works and how people are able to, it's kind of basically like subliminal messaging is what I think they call it. We actually in chapter 20 go and have Sita try to attack more of the Tellar. She goes and basically tries to kill some more of the Tellar, meets a couple that she thinks can be used to help infiltrate where Haru is, and that does not go over very well, honestly. It really doesn't. Not in the way I think that Sita had originally planned, but, you know, that's what happens. So then, chapter 21, we have Sita going and talking to Bertrand after the things that happened in chapter 20. And she's kind of like noticing that Bertrand is not really starting to trust her just because of all these crazy things that Sita is doing and you know, it's causing her to basically not really believe that Sita is on her side by any means because she's kind of taking things into her own hands, whereas Bertrand is like the one that's running the IIC. And I think mostly it's a kind of moment where like they all reconvene to like talk about what's going on, what the next step is. Mara decides that she's going to now get in on the next cradle session, and so chapter 22 is that session where Umara gets involved in it. She actually, you know, has her own sacrifice. And from there they go to attack Haru's team that are trapped in Egypt. They're kind of like hidden away, and Umara basically tells Sita that unfortunately, because of how powerful Haru is, she by herself is not able to go through and kill him herself. She actually has to experience something that she has been avoiding, which is, or has basically been suppressing, because Sita talks about how when she died trying to protect Seymour and when Terry died in that whole scenario, she doesn't remember really what happened when she died. She just basically remembers, you know, throwing herself in front of Seymour, and the next thing she remembers is waking up in Terry's body. So Umara says that in order for her to be able to gain the power she needs to take down Haru, she's gonna have to die for the 3rd time in this entire series and essentially relive what it was she went through when she died trying to protect Seymour. And so chapter 23 starts off that whole train of her going through basically the afterlife that she experienced when she had died for Seymour. It starts off where she sees herself dying again after being shot by Matt and then, you know, passing on. And from there, she ends up basically being transported to kind of this almost Greek-like scenario where, if many of you might know the river Styx, the story behind that, and how in order for souls to pass to the underworld. They had to pay the ferryman to cross the river Styx, and so she kind of has to do that, except instead of paying him money of any kind, like coins or something, she has to answer a riddle that only she knows the answer to, and it would basically, the answer to it would be something that she would carry through her life and then would carry on into her next life. And unfortunately that does not go over very well at first. She doesn't quite know how to answer stuff, but then she kind of tricks the ferryman in a sense to basically get her way through, and she meets two women that are there that say that they're supposed to be waiting for Sita to go across. One is a blonde woman she doesn't really seem to recognize. The other is, she describes as this woman who wears a silk robe and exquisite jewels. Her skin is like copper, her eyes like coal. And when she smiles at me, I know she's a friend, even if I can't remember her name. So we don't know who these women are. We don't know anything about them. But eventually she does get on the ferry to cross this river with the two women. And eventually kind of gets stuck, where she ends up having to move away from them and tries to find this path in order to figure out where this tunnel she's going down leads. And she comes across this woman in chapter 24, where the woman is like very beautiful. She, has this kind of aura about her, and the problem though is that this woman seems to be also very evil. She's not someone that is necessarily supposed to be helpful, but she says that if Sita kisses her, that she will help her go across this bridge that seems to be invisible or essentially non-existent, and she's the only one that knows how to go across. But if Sita kisses her, she will help her get across the bridge. And unfortunately this kind of makes it hard for Sita to trust her, because she doesn't know who this woman is, she doesn't know what her purpose is, but she kind of gets this feeling that this woman is evil. And the only way she's really able to fight against her is that she starts thinking about one of the riddles that she couldn't answer to the ferryman. It basically was a riddle that was kind of asking what is the greatest but also the worst human quality. Sita basically determines that it's faith, because there is such a thing as blind faith, which a lot of us kind of associate now with this idea of blindly following somebody, blindly believing in somebody for a cause, but not really thinking about what the messages mean, what kind of things are actually being said. And I think that this is very relevant in a lot of ways to modern day, because we have a large group of people that blindly follow individuals that they think are God, or they think that are the greatest things since sliced bread, but they have no actual ability to critically think about the things they're doing, the things they're saying, and all of these other things. Whereas, like myself, I don't blindly follow people, because I know that there is never going to ever be a time where somebody can always know the answer, and to put that kind of, for one, put that pressure on somebody is not something I would want to do, but also I don't want to blindly follow somebody, because I don't think that for instance, the government, I don't blindly follow any president, because I don't think they always have the people's best intentions, because they're politicians. They are going to do what they think is best, not necessarily what the majority of the citizens think. Now, that's not to say that presidents can't do good, but unfortunately we've come to a point in real life where blindly following people does not work. It doesn't work in terms of wanting progress to happen, basically. And then on the flip side of that, you have faith, where, having faith in things is a good thing. Having faith in yourself that you're going to move through things. Having faith in others that they're going to, be there for you in a sense. Having faith in general is, a good idea. And especially if you are religious, having faith in your religion and having faith that your God, your deity, the person that you pray to is going to protect you, is going to help you with going through tough times. That's all fine and dandy. The whole thing though is that with humanity, while we have these good aspects of faith happening, we also will blindly follow somebody based on that faith. And unfortunately, that is what gets us into trouble. And so her whole thing with dissecting that and looking into that is kind of the way she's able to fight off against this creature or whatever, and she's able to escape her. And then from there, in the same chapter, she comes across essentially what I like to call the kind of ancient Egyptian almost inspiration that's in this, that because there's a lot of ancient Egyptian talk in these books, and that is the scales, or for a lot of people it's the judgment. You know, it's not just an ancient Egyptian culture, but in a lot of religious practices, a lot of religious ideas, there is this idea that when you die, you will be judged based on how you were in your life. That goes from Christianity to even Buddhism in a sense, because of the idea of karma. You know, all of these different religions kind of have this idea of like, when you die, you will be judged based on your sins versus your virtues. And it kind of comes in different forms depending on which religion you follow. But in this book, they talk about how there's a physical scale, and each person goes up, states their name and their age, and the virtues are represented by white diamonds on the right-hand side of the scale, and sins are represented by black pearls that are on the left side of the scale. And depending on which side is heavier, you either are basically being sent to hell, or you're basically, I don't think it's necessarily going to heaven, but you're going towards a light, which I'm not sure if that indicates any kind of like reincarnation or any heaven-like state. That's not really ever discussed. I interpret it as kind of more of this reincarnation aspect, because I am a believer of reincarnation. I am a believer of the idea that when we die, our souls do get recycled depending on how we lived. And, you know, I think that that's kind of a big proponent of my belief. Now, you could take it as you will. I think that this is something that's definitely very much open to interpretation in terms of what you think that heaven-esque possible reincarnation pathway is. Like, you can believe whatever the hell it is you want to believe about that, but that's kind of the idea, is it's either like a heaven or a reincarnation or some form of divine light that is on the right hand side. Now, through this, we unfortunately learn that Sita has a lot of sins. And I do want to mention too that we do see the two women, because we were separated from them when we had gone across this witch character, this evil character that I just mentioned. We do get separated from the two women, but when we're at the scales, we do find out that the blonde woman is actually Terry's soul. And we don't recognize that until Terry states her name when she's getting judged. And thankfully, she had a very virtuous life, and so she moves on into the light. And we meet the other woman, who we don't necessarily still know who she is. I think it's either Paula or Umara. I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but basically it's another person that she recognizes from her real life. And like I said, unfortunately, we do see that Sita has more sins than she does virtues, because over her 5,000 years, and she actually states exactly how old she is in this. She says that she's 5,152 years old. So she's an old girl. And unfortunately, she does get pulled off towards where hell is. But before she goes into hell, she is stopped by this voice that says, essentially, you have another chance here. I'm going to give you another chance to take down somebody that is evil. You need to kill the light bearer, which we already discussed is the idea of Tirana, who is this evil entity, kind of possibly Lucifer in a sense. Oh, okay, so actually now I see here, she says that the second woman, the woman that had the copper skin, was Umara. And unfortunately, she does, come to realize that she thinks Umara is the light bearer because of things that she had said about how when the Tellar first got their immortality, how Umara kind of seemed to be the one that was carrying the light. She was the reason why everybody was remaining immortal, and she was the last of that original group that was able to remain immortal. And so Umara, believing that this is what needs to happen, kind of already knowing that she probably was going to die at some point over the course of this, allows Sita to kill her. And so that belief of Umara being the light bearer opens up this whole idea, and her being that last link really to that divine light that they were using for immortality, makes it so that Sita is now able to kill Haru and the Tellar. From there, basically, we do see in that same chapter Sita going in and talking to Hatram, who is the man. He's kind of like a zombified version of himself. We'll say that, because he originally had died many years ago, but was brought back to life in a sense. He's a kind of a familiar for somebody, and essentially Sita gets him to then go about his merry way. Umara is dead, who was the one that killed him, so he no longer has this vengeance, and so he's able to move freely. And from there, shit goes down really quick, because then she gets over to Haru and his team and is able to kill all of them in one fell fucking swoop, because they're weak now, because they no longer have their link to their immortality, and they no longer have their familiars with them, so they die. And then in chapter 26, we return back to where the IIC and the cradle is, and unfortunately we find out that nobody actually got the vaccine. Sita had actually injected every single person in the IIC with the virus, because she was trying to also kill off everybody in the IIC, which was kind of technically part of the plan in the beginning, but she wasn't going to tell anybody about it, because obviously we didn't want anyone to know in the IIC that Sita was also trying to kill all of them. So we do see that, you know, everything is kind of falling apart. She's basically like just saying, we're gonna destroy this place, everybody's gonna die, and let's get the fuck out of here, basically. From there, Cindy, though, does request that she goes with them. She no longer wants this, because she already knew that the cradle was so powerful that for her to stay, she had no control over it. So for her to escape would be meaning her to finally be free of everything with it. But she does request that her daughter comes with her, Jolie. She basically kills Tom, like, right off the bat. She shoots him in the head and is like, fuck you, I'm done with you. Take the kid and let's fucking go. And that's pretty much it. And then chapter 27, they are escaping the IIC. The building explodes as they are running away from it, but because now everybody in the IIC is killed, it set off this kind of security system where now all of them, including Cindy and Jolie, are basically fugitives. And that's not at all what they had planned. That is not what they thought was going to happen. So they have another possible issue with Tarana, because now Tarana is like vengeful. He got cheated, and so he possibly has something to do with what's going on here at a much deeper level than I think Sita had realized. And thankfully they're able to skirt around it, all these things, but just barely. They're just barely able to go through with all of that. Finally, in chapter 28, the last full chapter of this book, we have this interaction go on the entire chapter between Shanti and Sita. Shanti has been this character throughout the entirety of these stories where she's very quiet, she's very kind, loving, she kind of exudes this very like positive aura. Sita knows that her real only ability within this team is that for some reason she had been able to block the signal of the array coming in for Sita. One time she was able to block the array and stop it from controlling her, but they never knew why, they never knew what the purpose was of it. And throughout most of this whole interaction, Sita keeps questioning a lot of things that she's like, some of these things just don't make sense. And Shanti keeps trying to talk to her about it, trying to get her to, like, you know, open up about what's going on, thinking like, hey, I can help you work this out, kind of thing. There's other things you're not telling me about, you know, what happened when you died and all these things, and you know, what exactly did happen when you died now that you have clear memory of it. And so she goes through and talks about a lot of it. How she says that the riddles, like every time she would go through them, every time she would fail one, she'd forget the riddle and she wouldn't be able to like remember what the question was and how to answer it, and so she'd have to go back and all these things. And then how she met the witch woman, the woman that was, you know, saying she had to kiss her in order to get across the bridge and all these things. And from there, talking about the idea of blind faith. Again, like going in and talking about what it means about blind faith and all these things, and how Krishna had this whole idea about blind faith and how it's incredibly difficult to really put your faith in something so much, because with a lot of like dogmatic practices, you know, people who are so blindly faithful to all of that, they're gonna, you know, make it a bigger issue for themselves because they're not gonna have kind of this free thought almost. Then from there, we learn a little bit more about who Shanti really is, because there was this whole problem that Sita had where she thought she had given Shanti the original book that Yaksha had written, not a copy. And at one point she had a copy, but it wasn't a copy, it was the original, and so like it was very confusing for all of them. They did not know what was going on with it. But Sita finds out in this interaction now with Shanti that Shanti's been playing her the whole time. And the way she's been playing her is that she's been the host of Tirana this entire time. She has been the host of this familiar, this demon, the entire time. And it's not pretty. Tirana basically says that she's lost, that Sita is doomed to live in hell for the rest of her life because she's nothing but a monster, and she's made herself out to be a monster, and all these things. And he even talks about how he basically corrupted Shanti in a sense. Well, he says how Shanti, I keep saying Shanti and Shanti, I apologize, but he talks about how Shanti was originally not at all what she was made out to be. Like, everything about her life was basically a lie, and she was kind of somebody that was reaching out to Tirana, and so in order for her to gain his abilities, he wanted control of her. He wanted her to do certain things, like disfiguring her face, doing all of these crazy things so that he could have full control of her body. And that was how he was able to get Sita involved, because Shanti was portrayed to be this really quiet and kind person, and Sita ate it up like crazy, and so that was so easy for Tirana to get a hold of her. So basically the rest of this chapter is them kind of talking, and him saying that she's a monster, and she's always going to be a monster. She's never going to have any ability to be saved by Krishna because she's just not worthy of it. Basically, she does end up taking down the light bearer by talking about the first riddle that she had. The third riddle was the one she remembers clearly because it was the one she was able to answer. The second one she remembers when she first started talking about the idea of blind faith, all that stuff. And then the first one she still couldn't remember until now. And the riddle was, what is the most useless human emotion? Now, when I had first saw that, I thought guilt, because Sita had always, and this is the correct answer, it is guilt, because to Sita, she has killed in order to survive. That has been what she's been able to do. So it's stupid for her to feel guilty about killing others, especially those that are evil, because it's just what she is. She is a monster. She feeds on blood, kind of thing. And so she's able to actually defeat the light bearer in this instance by kind of finding out what that last riddle was that she couldn't remember. Goes after Lucifer, the light bearer, Tirana. She basically calls him, because she calls him by his real name, Lucifer, and says, you are the greatest of the great, the one who was given the divine light, but it wasn't enough for you. You wanted more. Unfortunately, when you went to war to get it, you had to call upon your great light. You had to dive deep into it. So deep you discovered, quite by accident, that the Lord you were fighting was the same as yourself. Most would have rejoiced in such a discovery that they were one with God, but you, it just made you want to run and hide. That is why you ended up in this God-forsaken realm. You were too proud to admit you were no different from the Lord, yet you never told the truth to the others who fought by your side. You damned them for no reason. You fell for nothing, which makes you nothing in my eyes. And she basically gains this power over him, this empowering feeling over him, and from there, having her back in Shanti's body she goes into talking about how guilt is the most useless of emotions. No matter how many people I've saved in my life, I still felt guilty about those I killed. It was my guilt that made me feel I didn't deserve to see Krishna. But it was all a lie, and you, the father of lies, exploited my weakness when you caused me to remember only a portion of what happened when I died. And that essentially is what Sita says right before she rips off Shanti's head from her body and throws it out a hotel window. And then we do have an epilogue, which truthfully was a little confusing to me at first, because I didn't know what the scene was supposed to be. But what we see is actually a scene we had seen earlier in the book, but it was slightly changed. So in the scene where we have Sita having the scales, measured, there's a point in that scene where Sita, instead of having her hands out like this, where the pearls and the diamonds would flow from her fingertips, as the imagery describes. At one point, after so much has already fallen from her fingertips, she puts her hands on the scales. And I thought that was a really weird interaction by itself, but there's a purpose that is dictated in this epilogue. Basically, she realizes that she was in her own way because she felt so guilty, which we just saw with this last chapter. She talked about how she felt so guilty about all the bad things that she had done that she almost basically sabotaged herself into becoming this person that was going to be sent to hell, because she didn't think that she deserved to see Krishna. She didn't deserve to be embraced in his grace and all of these things. She thought that she was so evil on the inside. She pretty much sabotaged her own scaling. And in this epilogue scene, you see that whole scene again, but changed, where because she finally let go of this guilt and realized how useless of an emotion it was for her because she cannot change what has happened, it kind of changes the scene where instead of her skills tipping to where she'd go to hell, it actually tips in her favor. And then she goes and sees this figure that was the person telling her, you're going to hell, you're going to burn, and before you do, there is this way for you to find out, a way to stop this Tellar group from causing issues. That figure then turns actually into Krishna. Now, whether this is a scene that dictates that Sita's story is over is not at all what's happening, because obviously we have a whole other book still that I need to read that is in this series. However, what this does indicate to me is this is a scene that essentially dictates that Sita now understands her worth. The entirety of this series, she goes through so many things that constantly cause her to feel like she is never going to obtain happiness. She's never going to obtain the grace of Krishna and be able to, when she dies, die with him, believing in her and die with her, honor in a sense. Seeing it be a redo of the scene we saw earlier in the book indicated to me that she's now in a place where she accepts what she's done. She now accepts that guilt is not something she should be feeling because everything she's done has been done. There's no changing it. There's no going back and changing it. Essentially, the shadow of death concludes with this idea that Sita is now able to accept what she's done, and through that acceptance, she then gains Krishna's grace because she accepts that what she's done has been wrong, and that's, that acceptance of who you are, that acceptance of understanding your faults and, accepting that you have done bad things as opposed to brushing them off, as opposed to thinking that you did nothing wrong and were holier than thou, and kind of giving yourself up to your deity, your God, your, patron saint, whatever it is, giving yourself up to them fully by accepting your faults, accepting your flaws. That is how she's able to gain his grace. And it makes me so happy because it makes me remember the fact that, Sita always has been this character that's been so down on herself and has been so guilt-ridden, that to finally see her heart lighten at the end of this book makes me hopeful. So, let's now get into my thoughts on the story by itself. So like I said before, I think that the info dumpiness of this entire story does bog down the story a little bit because it's such a very confusing point. This is a full-length novel, but because it's one of the only 3 full-length novels in this series, and the first one we're getting all of this information about all these different things that we started to learn about in the first full-length novel of this series, there's a lot of information to take in, and I think now, having finished the book, some of the thoughts I had earlier about this info dumpiness are changed because I think that in its reality, it's slowed down enough to where it wasn't necessarily slowing down the pace and making it feel like a dredge, but all of the info dumpy parts got kind of intense. And I think that for somebody who's not necessarily super involved with the world or doesn't quite understand the religion or the mythology that's involved in this story, because we pull from Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, ancient Egyptian culture, Greek mythology. Like, we pull from so many areas of the world, and it all gets like basically jam-packed into this book that I think it's a little intimidating. Even as someone who has, you know, come to this story with fresh eyes, knowing, you know, some of the things that are involved with it from the other books. I just feel like that the info dumpiness of the story really kind of bogged it down in a sense to where a person who is not already familiar with any of these mythologies or any of these religions or anything to do with the thoughts and the, you know, theories on anything regarding those things, they're not gonna really get it. They're not gonna really understand anything about what is going on in this and how it relates to what we know of modern day Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or anything like that. So it's just, I think that in its entirety is kind of making me feel like this can't be a 5-star, because I think that it just really made the story so much more complex to the point where I think it almost became a little unenjoyable at times, but it was still enjoyable for me. I felt like I still really enjoyed the whole story front to back, and I don't know. I feel like the info dumpiness of it made me feel very unsettled after a point in time. I think that the overall plot of the story was well done. I thought that incorporating this whole idea of Sita now going back in time again, seeing things kind of unfold again from a fresh perspective, it really added to the story, because we've seen that again, like I said before, in like the latter half of the novellas. We saw that happen where she went back in time to change something, to fix something, and with this fresh perspective, she was able to like understand things that she had missed the first time. And I think that seeing that kind of happen again in this one was also very helpful with understanding the whole process of what exactly happened when she died and why she was, you know, repressing it in a sense. I really enjoyed it. I think that like there's so many good qualities about it that I can almost overlook a lot of the info dumpiness, but I can't, because I also feel like it's just super, super complex, that it's not as accessible, I think, to a lot of people unless like you're a little more familiar with the different religions and philosophies and, you know, mythologies that are involved in this. So that's kind of my overall thoughts on it. I think that it's honestly like I feel like this would have possibly been the ending of this series. It's entirely possible it could have been, and then Pike was like, wait, there's something else I want to go into its entirety that really ends the series. So I think the last book goes into something about her most traumatic experience in her entire life. I want to say it has to do something with World War II, and I do know that a scene we had experienced in that past timeline where we basically had her go back in time, the characters that were involved in that time travel kind of story, I'm fairly certain they play into the ending of the last book that I think was what threw me when I was a teenager, because the ending of the last book I remember I felt was completely out of left field. I didn't know how to feel about it, but I think now, having reread this series, I think that the ending of that book's gonna be a lot easier on me, because I think I'm actually going to understand what was happening at the end of that book. But to conclude, 4 out of 5 stars for The Shadow of Death. I'm sorry that this video was super, super long. I felt like I really wanted, though, to go into this story deeply, because I knew that with this full-length novel that was going to be so heavy on the info dumping, like, I had a feeling it was going to be this kind of a story, and I'm glad that I did this longer video for it, especially for those of you that are looking for an in-depth review of these different things and talking about these different things that come up. It's super important to me to really emphasize a lot of the stuff that's going on here, because this is, I think, a very complex story that on the surface doesn't look like it based on the first 6 novellas. But once you get to the full-length novels, it gets so much more complex, and I appreciate it so much. And I think it's reminding me why I love this series so much as a teenager. If you guys did enjoy this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be, hit the button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.